Well, we've been talking about painting and particularly weathering, and today I want to go through the 6 basic steps that we use when we're weathering any model. We're talking about train cars, in particular gondolas, but it would apply to military models, automobiles, anything. Now, before we start on the 6 steps, I guess you could call this a pre-step. But you never want to undertake any project, particularly a model, without first really planning it out and making sure you have the proper tools and supplies that you need. Now, I'm operating on the assumption that your model is already painted. In this case, and in the case of a lot of these train cars, because they were delivered painted, with decals, lettering, whatever in place, or that may have been something that you already did. But this is just simply about weathering the model once you have the basic paint job on it. Now, for all intents and purposes, it's going to be the same whether you painted the model and lettered it yourself or you bought a finished model that was already painted and lettered from the factory. We need to gather together the paints that we're going to be using. For the most part, I'm going to be using these very affordable craft water-based acrylics. The paints themselves cost at most a couple of dollars. The only thing that we're going to be using of a high end here is the Vallejo airbrush thinner, which is the gold standard when thinning any water-based acrylic, I think. Now, because I'm doing a plastic model that's supposed to look like wood, I've gathered together my faded wood colors here, very, very light brown grays and grays, because that's sort of what happens to wood when it's left out in the weather. It turns into a feathery gray color. I also need a very light tan, or this barnwood, to use as dust at the very end. I also need to match as closely as possible the basic color of the car in order to do faded lettering. I also need very dark colors for doing my dark washes. This is black and a very dark gray called pavement, and raw umber, very dark brown. Now, the tools that I'm going to be using is an airbrush. I actually have 2 different airbrushes because I use one airbrush for my solvent-based paints and a different one for my water-based acrylics. You really need a decent double-action airbrush in order to do proper weathering. I have seen some really good weathering done with just a regular paintbrush, so it can be done, but I just can't accomplish anything without an airbrush. And of course, you're going to need some paint brushes, some decent, fairly fine paint brushes, but also some very broad, much heavier than you might think brushes, much larger than you might think for putting on washes. And those can be kind of gnarly and ratty, frankly. And I can't function without a rotary tool. I use a Dremel. But Karen has also put me on to using engraving tools. And some small saws. They don't have to be the whole saw. It can just be the saw blade, as most of these are removable. But for doing wood graining and wood distressing. Now, in planning out our project, we need to make a determination of just how far do we want to go and how much is too much. There's a great tendency to go too far. And, well, you can't come back. You can always add more weathering, but you can't subtract weathering. On my railroad, most of my cars show about this amount of weathering, but I like to have a mixture. I like to have some of the cars looking almost factory fresh and others looking much more distressed. I tend to not go completely over the top and do some really extreme weathering. Here we can see 3 different locomotives. On the far left is C19 with virtually no weathering. In the center, a K27 with a tremendous amount of weathering. And to the right, a K36 with just a little bit of weathering. Kind of my preference. Okay, let's take a quick look at some prototypes. This would be what a wooden gondola looks like straight out of the shop. The lettering has just been applied, and so it's crisp and clean and perfectly white. Once a car's been out in the elements for a while, it's the dark colors that fade first because they absorb more sunlight. But the white lettering is quick to follow, usually because it actually starts to flake off and peel. But you can see it just sort of disintegrates over time. But we're going to be using a technique for fading the lettering. But it's the inside of the car that really gets disintegrated because material, mine ore or coal or any number of different heavy stone materials are going to be dumped in here, destroying the insides of the car. And while loading the material into the car will damage the top board, in this case it's a rotary car dumper that's caused most of this damage. But you're going to see a lot of damage to the uppermost board. Now here's what we're starting off with. In this case, these are factory painted cars, but this may also be a paint job and lettering that you have applied. But this is what we're starting with. A painted, finished car now ready to be weathered. Okay, step one, physically stressing the model. In the case of these wood gondolas, that means destroying some of the wood, working principally from the inside of the car. But as we mentioned, it's the top board that really takes the abuse. So I'm using a rotary tool here with a sanding drum to go in and really attack, especially the top board. I'm mostly leaving the board intact in terms of its physical straightness, if you will, but in a few places I'm sort of scalloping that as well because that's a typical damage that you would see to this top board. But mostly what I'm after doing here is just thinning it down and adding some real physical abuse to the inside of the car. I cannot overemphasize working slowly and giving yourself some time to really think about what you're doing. You can always add more stress. You cannot take the damage away once you've created it. It is so much easier to create stress in simulated wood this way. If you're working with a metal model, this is an automobile I built years and years ago, you have to actually physically bend and dent the metal, and that's tricky to do. In this case, I've used another rotary tool with a ball-shaped cutter working from the back side to thin the material, and then as it's still warm from the cutting tool, in the area where I've thinned it out, very carefully bend it. In this area, I've created rust through using the same small ball-shaped high-speed cutting tool working from the back side. But instead of bending it, just go all the way through with the tool, creating these small holes. Broken glass is fun to do. I used a drill bit in my rotary tool to punch through with a hole, and then coming back with a sharp number 11 X-Acto blade, carefully scratch the cracks into the back side of the glass. Okay, back to the wood gondola. Now that I have used the rotary tool to really subtract a lot of the material here, I'm going to go in with a hand tool and carve away more of the material using a saw blade because I want the teeth of the saw blade to create wood grain. The saw blade does such a great job at distressing the plastic to look like distressed wood. It's even creating what appears to be wood splinters. But just using a saw blade as a cutting tool this way, just the teeth, letting the teeth cut into the plastic, will create a very natural wood grain, distressed wood grain effect. The drop bottom gondolas are all cast out of the boxcar red color, but in this case the high side gondola is cast out of a wood colored plastic and then painted so that as I'm carving into this, it's revealing the wood color underneath, and that's a really nice effect. But it's nice to add wood grain, this distressed wood grain, anywhere where you think it will really enhance the model. Okay, base colors. I mean, this is sort of getting back to base colors. These models were completely painted before we started weathering them, but some of the basic colors can't be added until after the car has been distressed. Again, in this case, it's the inside of the car which has been mostly distressed, and moreover, the color inside here shouldn't be the boxcar red. It should be the light, feathery grays and browns of heavily weathered wood. I'm using two different colors here. The high side gondola mostly carries mine ore, and so it's going to be a lighter gray. Everything that goes in here is a light gray material, where the drop bottom gondolas carry coal and cinders and road ballast, and the inside is much more stained by the coal and cinders. Okay, step 3, applying dark washes. These are very dark colors, black and dark gray and burnt umber and that kind of thing. And these are going to be very, very dilute so that they set down into the cracks and the wood grain and that sort of thing. So I'm just using a little cup of water here and a little bit of paint color and just making sure that what I've got here is very, very thin so that it goes down into the wood grain and into the cracks between the boards. Now I've put a drop or two of just a liquid soap into my little cup of water, which helps the dilute paint spread evenly across the surface. It breaks the surface tension of the water. Otherwise, it tends to want to bead up. In some areas here, I'm not diluting the paint as much. It's still heavily dilute. I want it to really soak down into the distressing that I've added here. But I want to move a little more color. I'm going to be working in multiple layers here. Again, going gradually, saying a little bit more, because if you go too far, well, there's no backing off of that, is there? This is going to be much darker and much more obvious as you're putting it on. Once you allow it to dry, a lot of what you're doing here tends to sort of disappear. And be careful not to really scrub it back and forth very much, because it's already starting to cut into the base color, and if we soften it too much, it's going to take the base color right off and reveal the red color underneath again. It gets really sloppy down in here, and I like to tilt the model back and forth to simulate the effect of water actually running across the surface here. On the high side gondola, I'm actually using a very dark gray color, where on the drop bottom gondolas, I'm using straight up black. One of the things I want to do with both models is really enhance the separation between the boards. And so this material is soaking down into those gaps between the boards, but I'm going to come back with a fine point Sharpie and get right down into those gaps between the boards and just run my fine point Sharpie down through there. Now the contrast between the dark color wash and the lighter colors is pretty intense, but that's going to get mellowed out quite a bit when I apply dust later on. Now I'm doing several coats. I think I ended up doing about 10 different coats on the bottom of the car, using both the gray and the black, and later on even kind of a lighter mud color, to really simulate what goes on the bottom of the car as all kinds of gooey, crappy material gets kicked up in here. I also came in with the darker color and painted over the labels on the bottom here that say made in China and so on. But again, I'm working in lighter coats, one upon another, because again, if I go too far, well, I can't back away from that, but I can always add more. Okay, step 4, fading the colors, adding sun fade. Mostly what I'm trying to do in this case is fade out the lettering. So I'm using a color very similar to the color of the car, a little tiny bit lighter than the color of the car. And then I'm going to airbrush that in a very light mist over the outside of the car. The goal being to add just a little bit of this color to the lettering so that the lettering appears to be fading and peeling and going away and revealing some of the car color through the lettering. And each car is going to be treated differently here. I want some of the lettering to appear to be fairly new and fresh, while I want some of the lettering to appear to be rather heavily faded and peeling. I haven't taken any of these cars as far as this prototype car, but in some instances I will, just because I like seeing some of the cars looking a lot more distressed than others. Okay, step 5, adding rust and dust. Let's start off by dealing with the rust. My favorite rust color is the old Model Master enamel, but thinned with lacquer thinner. This is not, of course, a rust color, but I'm always looking for Model Master rust. It's been off the market for like 10 years, but I just love the look of this Model Master rust color. In this case, I'm just going to go in and lightly airbrush some of this rust color onto areas where I want to see a bare metal that's just rusted completely away. Mostly what we're talking about here are the knuckle couplers. Okay, now let's add dust. I've switched over to the water-based acrylics in a very, very light tan color, a very dusty color. And mostly what I'm trying to put on here is material that would have been kicked up by the wheels. There's always a certain amount of just dirt on the tracks that's kicked up by the wheels onto the bottom of the car and onto the sides and ends of the car. But also just overall dirt that just ends up on the cars. Dusty, dusty dirt. And it mellows out a lot of the contrast that we've seen in the dark washes. And so again, where the dark washes came in fairly contrasty, a lot of separation between the light and dark, this is going to really, really mellow that out. And this is where it's really important to have a double action airbrush so you can really go with these light mists. And finally, a little bit of touch-up here and there and applying a clear coat. There are a few places where I've airbrushed in, for example, here with this rust, and I've gotten a little bit of the rust color up onto the knuckle mechanism and in places that I just don't want it. So I'm coming in here and just putting a thin wash on the coupler pocket so it doesn't exactly look like the coupler. I want the coupler to be rusty, and I want the coupler pocket to be just a little bit dirty. And then I also need to add a little color to the cut lever there where it's gotten too much rust on it. The wheels are mostly a shiny silver color, which is fine on the running surface. And I've gotten a little overspray on the fronts and backs, but I want to enhance that. So I'm going in with some dark gray just to paint in the fronts and backs of the wheels, leaving the surface of the wheel, the running surface, a bright shiny silver. And now to apply Tester's dull coat to everything. Sometimes I don't do this because some cars you want to have some shiny areas where they've had gloss paint that's maybe gotten dirty in places, but I don't want to disturb the gloss. In this case, I definitely want to disturb the gloss. Any of the glossy areas here are simply because the paint has dried in such a way that it looks glossy and it just doesn't look right. Here on the inside of the car, you can see there's a certain amount of sheen, and I want to knock that down. I want all of this area to be quite flat. So I've taken the cars outside here because I'm using a rattle can of Tester's dull coat, and typical of a rattle can, the overspray wants to go absolutely everywhere. So you don't want to use this inside. So I've got these folding tables that I use just for rattle can painting outside. I'll set those up out in the driveway and apply my paint. And you can see it goes on really, really glossy. But in just a few minutes, it glosses off and just becomes a nice, even, uniform, dull coat. And with that, the cars are finished. We always say around here, well, nothing's ever really finished, because every once in a while you go, hey, this could be improved, as Walt Disney said, this could be plussed. But I think these have turned out quite nice, and they're probably just going to stay like this for the rest of their lives. And they can now be operated on the railroad and look really, really good doing it. One of the really nice things about having half of the railroad outdoors this way is it's fun to see what the models look like in actual sunlight. But one, I guess you could say, downside here is you can see things really, really well when you get them out in the sunlight in the bright light. And if there are any small problems, you're going to spot them. Anyway, after modeling and weathering my models now for something around 55 years, something like that, I've broken it out into these 6 steps, and so I thought I would share that with you. See if you don't want to embrace the idea of 6-step weathering. Well, hopefully you found this informative. Hopefully maybe you've even found it a little bit entertaining. And hopefully this means you're going to want to subscribe to the channel. And so if you're not already a subscriber, please subscribe by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink, right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We sure hope you didn't find it boring. And Karen and I will see you here on Sunday. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.